taken that role. I've taken that role on over the course of the last 3 or 4 weeks, but that opens up a new line of conversation, certainly for me, in terms of the strategic global commercial business opportunities that we all see and read about in the press. So today I want to talk about culture and its impact in dispute resolution and mediation, and deal with it in 4 sections. Culture, what is it? Why is it important in mediation? The art of communication and culture, and the role of the culturally aware mediator. So let's start with, I can't see any slides at the moment, Jeffrey, so let me just, have you got some slides there, Jeffrey? Bear with us, everybody. I will keep talking whilst Jeffrey deals with that. So what is culture? When we think of culture, we may think of art, dress, religion, language, food, or a total range of activities and ideas of people. Culture includes attitudes, understandings, values, beliefs, and ideas. It's really how we behave, how we perform, and certainly it's more than a person's nationality or ethnicity. It's really one of the most important concepts of life. It plays a crucial role in our social lives. It's important for shaping social relationships, maintaining and challenging social order. And it's how we behave depending on the place, time, and audience, and how we express identities of race, class, gender, and sexuality, amongst others. Naturally, culture also includes the collective practices we participate in, such as religious ceremonies, the celebration of secular holidays, or attending sporting events. And importantly, how people communicate with one another varies wildly from culture to culture. In our global economy, it's more important than ever to understand these differences and where they come from. One way to reach such an understanding is through the high and low context culture, which was developed several decades ago by an anthropologist, Edward T. Hall. High and context and low context cultures is a subject which has been written about extensively, and one of the great books which I would thoroughly recommend to you, some of you may have already read it, is The Culture Map, written by Erin Myers. And she provides a toolkit to help one understand the different cultures and how to interact with them to achieve the desired outcomes. And I'll come back to that toolkit a little bit later. But what are the differences between high context and low context cultures? In low context cultures, we expect communications to be explicitly stated so that there is no risk of confusion. And in the most extreme cases, leaving any sort of wiggle room for interpretation can be absolutely disastrous. At the other end of the scale, people within high context cultures tend to be far more aware and observant of facial expressions, of body language, of changes in tone, and other aspects of communication that are not directly spoken, the non-verbal signals. Low context cultures tend to be individualist cultures in which they highly value the development of the individual, and human beings are seen primarily as autonomous. As a consequence, personal freedom is regarded as important, and emphasis is put on the rights of the individual and their freedom of choice. Individuals are free to challenge authorities and norms and are indeed encouraged to derive their own conclusions and form their opinions independently from others. Competition is encouraged, and conflicts, which can arise frequently and naturally, will be settled by reference to the legal rules, and many of us on this call will be very familiar with that. Judgments equally bind those in positions of authority, and it is only as a secondary step do individualist societies consider human beings belonging to a group. And as such, the form of social organization can be seen by some as rather loose, with individuals choosing which groups they belong to and which they do not. At the other end of the spectrum, high context cultures will tend to be far more collectivist, putting the emphasis on the well-being of the overall community as opposed to the individual, and the individual, as a result, plays a subordinated role. Social organization in high context cultures and collectivist cultures is hierarchical. A membership in a group is often determined by birth, as indeed is authority. One doesn't acquire authority really by way of achievement, as one might do in a low context individualist society. The family is often of fundamental importance, but so are other groups, such as the clan. The rights and development of the individual tend to be secondary to the interests of the community as a whole. And these are really important issues when we start to look at the impact on how this affects mediation and the attitude to conflict, the approaches to resolution. So can we go on to the next slide, please? Can you do the next slide, Jeffrey? Thank you. So some of the most important cultural differences are that, as I said, in individualistic, low context cultures, people seeing themselves as autonomous, they're far more likely to see conflict just as a way of life. And indeed, in some Western cultures, it is accepted that conflict is necessary, arguably enjoyable for some, part of life. But in the higher context cultures, where people see themselves as connected to others, the desire for harmony and to sustain wider social relationships takes far more precedence. And as a longer term view of managing conflict, that follows. The high context cultures, conflicts will be avoided as they threaten the harmony within the group. And if they arise, they will be settled according to tradition and the group interest. So although individuals don't weigh much in society in high context cultures, the relationship between individuals is absolutely crucial. How a person is seen in a group is of great importance, which is why people accept material loss in order to restore their honor and that of the group to which they belong. So in terms of attitudes to conflict, the harmony requirements and the emphasis on face saving in these high context cultures have led to a very different communication style, diametrically opposite to the frankness shown in particularly in low context cultures and low context culture driven countries. These low context cultures and societies value straightforward approach to talks. Opinions are openly stated, direct questions are asked, and alternatives are often laid out. An efficient business-like attitude in which results are produced quickly is characteristic of such a culture, and that highly informational style of communication which one may recognize in Western style economies. But in a negotiation forum influenced by legal proceedings, participants don't hesitate to contradict each other and indeed to refuse proposals. This is very different in high context societies where communication follows radically different patterns. The approach is far less direct, far less committal. Face-saving constraint dictates that it must be avoided if possible, both to avoid contradiction as well as to being contradicted. And as a consequence, rather than rebuffing a proposal or running the risk of being contradicted when making a counter proposal, reactions of the other side in a high context society will be tested carefully, looking for verbal signals until one is absolutely confident that the proposal can be accepted. And how does this then play out in the negotiation phase? Low context negotiators can easily be irritated by such behavior. They see it being interpreted as procrastination rather than constituting a real desire to find a solution. So for mediation to succeed, participants from high context societies, relationships need to be constructed. The lines between social conversation and business negotiation are far less pronounced than in the individualist societies. And if the talks are less direct and much more emphasis is put on non-verbal forms of communication, such as body language, what is not said is often as important, if not more important, than what is said. So let's now look at the role of communication. Next slide, please, Jeffrey. Communication, as we know, is very much a two-way process. It's far more than the delivery of information. Delivery of information, just back, please, Jeffrey. Delivery of information is very much a one-way process. Communication, as I say, is a two-way process. And cultural diversity, if not handled well, can be the source of confusion and frustration. If we don't appreciate the cultural differences in how others convey and interpret information, we are more likely to be misunderstood and to misunderstand them. So what happens when people from other countries and other cultures don't behave according to our cultural norms? We attribute their behavior to their personality. It's just who they are. And the default position that I've seen is one makes little attempt to understand how culture plays a role in the different style of communication. Coming back to Erin Myers and her cultural map, she puts it, subtle differences in communication patterns and the complex variations in what is considered good business or common sense from one country to another have a tremendous impact on how we understand one another and ultimately how we get the job done. Communication in high context and low context cultures, as I've said, varies. And it is vital that as mediators, we appreciate these differences and take steps to reduce the communication gap instead of causing misunderstanding and any unnecessary conflict. So let's look at this in a little more detail. So imagine I'm in a low context culture and I give you a presentation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you about, tell you it, and then tell you what I've told you. Everything is about simplicity and the clarity of the messages. In the high context culture, if I give you a presentation, it's assumed there is a much larger body of shared reference points. It's believed that effective communication is a little more sophisticated and implicit given what is unspoken. And Erin Myers developed an 8-scale model which shows how cultures vary across a spectrum from one extreme to another. She describes it as not being two-dimensional. When one is examining people from different cultures and how they relate to each other, what matters is not the absolute position of either culture on the scale, but rather the relative position of the two cultures who are interacting. And it is this relative position that determines how people view each other. So just by way of example, looking at the output of her research, may not come as a surprise that the United States is the lowest context culture in the world, followed by Canada, Australia, Netherlands, Germany, and the UK. European countries such as Italy, Spain, France, some of the Latin American countries of Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina fall into the middle right of the scale. Many of the African and Asian countries with their rich tradition in high context collectivist cultures are on the right hand side, and Japan is found to be the highest context culture in the world. And it's important when thinking about these cultures to bear in mind how are we going to communicate styles across the cultures. So let's just look at a little bit more detail in what it looks like in a high context culture. As I said, communication is indirect, implicit, subtle, and layered. Non-verbal cues such as the tone of voice, eye movements, gestures, facial expressions carry a great deal of meaning. And often the true intent of a message is not communicated verbally and is often left to interpretation of the individual, which requires contextual understanding and reading between the lines. Focus is on the long-term relationships to derive meaning and make the explicitness unnecessary. Individuals who value that high context communication will find the low context style of communication is extremely detailed, distrustful, waste of time, repetitious. So if you're from a high context culture, you may find a low context communicator as condescending, even patronizing, and may think of words such as "you talk to us like children." In the low context culture, communication, as I said, is far more concise, straightforward, and clear and explicit. It requires attention to the literal meanings of words rather than the context surrounding them. The emphasis is on the sending and receiving of accurate messages. Nothing is left to interpretation. An actual intent is conveyed in words. And those who are familiar with English and Welsh law, this will resonate very clearly. Repetition is often used to provide the necessary clarity. And the purpose and the outcome of the communication takes precedence over the interpersonal relationships. More value is placed on logic, facts, and directness of the messages. But how do people in the low context communication field find the high context communicators? They will see them as maybe lazy, undisciplined, not open, lacking in transparency, unable to communicate effectively, and trying to spend far too much time in building relationships. So how do you then look to communicate effectively across cultures? First is to identify your own style. If you use a high context communication, you're relying on both verbal and non-verbal cues, often implicitly stating what you intend and expecting others to derive a meaning from it. You're a low context communicator if you explicitly state what you expect by being far more direct to help others make sense out of your words without having to interpret what you intend to say. In short, you say what you mean. In the high context field, you expect others to read between the lines. So when working with people from a high context culture, it's important to try and watch, to listen, to speak less. Often as a message that I was told when I was very young, listen before you speak and learn before you act. And if you're from a low context culture, working with someone from a high context culture, don't rely on making literal sense of the words or try and interpret what might be behind the message. Asking the open-ended questions. And it's always best to clarify your understanding than to assume what you've understood. Watch out for the phrases as a sign to extract more information, such as, "I think about it," or "I guess so," "I will do my best." It will be very difficult, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So when it's your turn to pass on a message to someone from a high context culture, try to repeat less, but observe if your message has been well received. Using the effective listening as a way to determine their level of understanding and using that learning to add the missing information or make corrections will serve you well. But if you're from a high context culture and working in a mediation with someone from a low context culture, then focus on the content of the message without looking for hidden meaning. Don't hesitate to ask for the clarifying questions if the intent isn't clear. People from low context cultures will appreciate your directness in seeking clarity as opposed to keeping quiet and ensuring that there is no gap in understanding. When sending a message to someone from the low context culture, be really clear and explicit. Convey the main idea first, and don't wait until the end to state what you actually intend to convey. So let's demonstrate the point by way of a simple advertisement. And this was an advertisement for the same product, but catering for different context cultures. So the first advertisement, and it's for a toothpaste. It read like this: now there is something more dentists can recommend your gums for your gums that's proven to help them get healthier. Crest Plus Gum is the only cavity fighting toothpaste that's so effective, and it's clinically proven to reserve the gum disease gingivitis. Just what the dentist ordered. Lots of detail in there, and clearly meant for people with a low context culture as being direct and informative. The same product, when advertised for the high context culture, read, behind that healthy smile, there's a Crest kid. Everything is implied. Because the information is implied, the advertisement appeals to those people from the high context culture. So I hope that you will have felt that actually understanding the cultures that are around the table is really important in terms of mediation. Next slide, please, Jeffrey. An understanding of cultural issues is essential for mediators. Our individual experience of culture shapes and informs our attitudes and our approach to resolving conflict. Mediation itself is not culture-free. There is a danger that in our neutral and impartial role as mediators, we may see ourselves as free of cultural influences. If we assume that we know or indeed share common values, beliefs, and understandings, we may not ask the important questions that ask participants to speak for themselves and to convey the message they would want to convey. As mediators, we assume that direct communication is required to resolve conflict, but some cultures simply do not like face-to-face negotiation. And those non-verbal differences that I've highlighted can have a significant impact. A nod in some cultures means no. A shake of the head in some cultures means yes. In the Anglo-Saxon cultures, a nod certainly means yes, and a shake of the head certainly means no. Avoiding eye contact is polite in one culture, but can indicate evasiveness in others. Silence is sometimes rude in one, but a sign of respect in others. So different attitudes to verbal and non-verbal communication are likely to complicate the communication process. And the direct, frank, confrontational style prevalent in low context societies can easily be understood as rudeness and lack of respect in the high context societies. So some tips. Understand your own communication style. Locate the individuals and the parties in Erin Mayer's scale, whether they are high context or low context. Make adjustments in your messaging and your communication style to those contexts, in which cultures in which with which you're negotiating, and encourage each of the parties to understand the importance of the differences in culture and to develop their own language to communicate effectively with the other party. So by way of conclusion, in order to succeed internationally, businesses undoubtedly in this global environment, in this global economy, need to understand communication and negotiation techniques of each culture in which they conduct business. Culture is an important factor in business. And in the legal context, because cultural misunderstanding can create disputes and cause negotiations to fail. It's equally an important factor in mediation and helping parties feel comfortable to trust the process and work towards a resolution. Mediators should remember that all of us are culturally unique. We differ in how we solve problems that we face in everyday life. So for me, understanding as a mediator how we affect the participants' interaction in the mediation is hugely important. We should help to create a climate in which a person can be productive, comfortable and involved. And understanding those different themes in terms of the communication piece. We need to build trust, and building trust across cultures can be challenging, but equally it can be a huge privilege. Mediation is very much based on communication. And if we get it right as mediators, then wherever there are communicative or cultural barriers, there is still a way through for mediation. As I hope you've taken away, communication methods vary from country to country, depending on historical developments, legal systems, ethnic and cultural backgrounds of each area. But the key to making mediation successful globally is to understand those cultural differences, how they impact on business negotiation, and how they impact on communication techniques in bringing parties together to help them find the solutions that deliver that win-win solution that is embedded within the mediation process. Thank you very much indeed for watching, for listening, and yeah, open up for let's have a conversation.
Yes.
Peter, thank you. That was brilliant. Go on, Jeffrey.
Sorry, yes, just getting back on camera there. Peter, that was really such a lot of really interesting detail there to think about. I think I've got a couple of questions myself, but just looking at the chat, there are two come in from Kishore, who's in India. One of his first question is, what is the impact of economic globalization on members of low and high context cultures? Do you want me to repeat that?
No, that's good. No, it's a great question. So for me, it's very much around forging relationships and cultures and understanding what other parties are looking for, what's important to them. But as I said, in terms of that mediation process, trying to understand and respecting the other culture when you're negotiating business deals, solutions, resolution to disputes. It's an exciting period to be in business. And I think that the world is becoming far more aware of cultural differences and embracing it. So how it impacts, I think the businesses, the organizations in those different cultures that respect and understand the cultures and the communication styles in a different cultured context culture will be the ones that succeed. If you're in a low context culture and you behave consistently in a low context culture, you're not going to forge those relationships that you are looking for in a high context culture. I hope that makes sense. So,
I've got a second, thank you for that. I've got a second question from Kishore, which is, do profit motives of parties trump their cultural practices?
Great question. And probably there's a big debate about you can have a big debate about that, I'm sure. For me, what I am seeing more and more globally, and maybe it's because I'm sitting in a within a business in the UK, actually the sense of purpose is becoming far more prevalent, and how people interact with others, how people interact with the environment, and yes, people are in business to make a profit, but I'm not seeing that as the be all and end all. I think there's certainly, and I'll be interested in views of others, but I'm seeing a shift towards more purpose-driven businesses generally across the world.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. We have another question. First of all, saying thank you very much. That was very interesting. Are you able to give us some examples from mediations you've conducted of some of the hurdles you have had to overcome to help the parties resolve their disputes? I guess that's within the context of the cultural things that you've been talking about.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, but it's, yes, when you are dealing with parties from different nationalities, different ethnic heritages, for me, it comes back to a point that I made during the course of my talk. It's using your ears and mouth in the way in which you were given them at birth. So listening first and picking up on those non-verbal signals and that body language, because that will give you the clues as to what is really under the skin. The number of times that, particularly as a litigator or as a mediator, actually the first thing that you heard isn't necessarily the real issue that's causing the problem. So it's really spending time listening and just probing and asking those open questions, which is really important. And when dealing with the low context cultures, it's trying to ascertain what does good look like for that party. What do they really want to achieve? What's that longer term goal?
That's interesting, isn't it? Because the cue sometimes isn't necessarily at the beginning of when somebody's talking. You often have to listen right to the end, and the message can sometimes come there. You know, I think there's a Latin thing of spectate caudam, look for the tail. Another question coming in is, how do you propose one should balance the cultural differences with individual differences in communication? We wouldn't, after all, want to move away from a global generalization that everyone communicates in the same way, only to replace it with regional / cultural generalizations. So the question in there is about how do you balance the cultural differences with individual differences in communication?
So for me, communication, as I said, is a two-way process. It's understanding where the party to whom you're communicating, where they're coming from, what their background. If I can't bring it back to a very simple line, there are people who, in normal life, will think of communicating far more by body language. They're very expressive in their body language and actually very limited in their verbal signals. Mm. So it's understanding how parties communicate. It's a very individual style, and I think that thinking that we can get one form of communication across all cultures, and given the history of the cultures, I'm not sure we're ever going to achieve that, or indeed whether it's the right way to go about trying to force it, because I don't think it will work.
Yes, Okay, thank you for that, Peter. Another question that comes in from Tunisia is, what if cultural differences raise judgmental position that have a political source?
Very, yeah, good question.
That one, it's probably a good question. Whether it's one we can answer here.
Probably going to struggle to answer that one at the moment.
Okay,
but
I think. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, the political angle is a tricky one, and certainly in my role as the president of Hampshire Chamber of Commerce, that geopolitical space is becoming increasingly. I'm becoming increasingly aware of it, and how different nations are positioning themselves, and that strategic narrative. And yeah, it's a great question from Tunisia. Probably just understanding those political dynamics and how that fits. So that there's it's probably an interesting conversation to have there. Salma, perhaps pick that up in due course.
Indeed. But it is a point to add, isn't it, around that geopolitical stuff and how that influences culture and approach as well. Another question here is, absolutely agree that cultural mediation is beyond just language differences, and every mediator, business or otherwise, should have training on the importance of cultural diversity and its impact on successful mediation. More of a statement there, but I don't know if there's anything you want to reinforce on that.
No, I think Bibiana, I think you're absolutely right, and indeed, our mediators doing fellow mediators, serving them well if they are not culturally aware, because I think that it is hugely important, for the reasons I've gone into, that mediators recognize they're in a very privileged position in helping businesses resolve differences, but also if we are not culturally aware, then we run the risk of exacerbating a problem rather than solving it, or indeed facilitating a solution.
Yeah. We have another question in, thank you for that. So we have another question in, how can we overcome the difficulties of online mediation in high context countries?
Good question. And I'm probably, because I'm not from a high context culture. Yeah, I'd love to explore that one with some and if you, Eugenia, if you're able to throw in some ideas and some solutions, yeah, love to hear them.
Yes, indeed. That's all the questions that we have here at the moment, Peter. Does anybody else online have more questions for Peter? Now is your opportunity to, oh, here we go. Yes, so bang up to date. Can AI help bridge cultural gaps? How much do you know about AI, Peter?
That's an interesting one. I would be not convinced that AI can do it yet. I'm sure that in due course it will be able to do so. It's a bit like asking AI to replicate commercial nous. I don't think it can do that. It can replicate processes, but can it, and would I want to rely on AI to bridge cultural gaps? I think I wouldn't. I think we're a little way off yet. I'm not saying it won't, but I don't think it will. I don't think it will get there yet. And in many ways, the stakes are too high. Culture is just so important.
And it's at quite an early stage, isn't it?
Yeah.
although it is progressing rapidly. And I have actually seen myself online some behavioral tools there to actually help in the communication process. But I would say too, I'm yet to be convinced by it.
Yeah.
We have a reply back from Eugenia that parties don't want to come to online mediation. They seem to be suggesting it's a national cultural issue. And then
I get that. When you think of the importance of individuals within groups, within communities, being put on the spot, possibly, or feeling of being put on the spot in an online forum. Actually, you may prefer to do it surrounded within the group. And because human relationships and harmony is so important, yeah, I can understand why online mediation in high context societies is struggling to get traction.
Yes, yes. And then a couple of thanks from various people about some takeaways there of words having different meanings linguistically, for example. That comes in from one listener. And a fact-filled presentation, Peter, informative. So these are the great comments that are coming in. Any more questions, anyone, before we have a few minutes left?
I'll just put the name of that book in the chat, just in case people want to look at that, the cultural map.
Yes, I was going to. This is Erin Mayer's thing piece, is it?
Yeah.
Where Erin Mayer's scale.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Good. So,
and if you ever get a chance to hear her, as I have once, yeah, she's superb.
Yes, I'll certainly be looking her up. I made a note of it as you were giving your talk. So last chance, folks, for any more questions that you want to put to Peter. We're a few minutes ahead of our schedule, but I don't want to keep you here longer than necessary. So
one question.
Yes.
Actually, Peter, you see, one said is that Japanese negotiators are supposed to be the toughest one. So what are you see means the barriers in dealing with Japanese negotiators?
So they are steeped in history, and it's steeped in it's really trying to get under the skin of Japan and what they're looking for. And because they are they're so far to the right of the high context scale, it's if you're coming from a low context environment or a lower context environment, understanding and probing to ask the questions as to what does good look like for them, what do they really want out of this, is hugely important.
Does that answer your question, Keisha?
Thank you.
Yeah. Great.
And any comment? No. Would you like to say anything about the Chinese negotiators, Indian negotiators? Any comments?
India, I haven't had too many with China. India, I found straightforward, very straightforward, and it comes again often down to that geopolitical piece as well that I touched on earlier on.
Thank you,
And,
Kishore.
thank you.
Thank you very much. We've had another question coming in. What has been the most challenging culture jurisdiction for you to mediate in?
Good question.
I expect you've had so many, Peter.
No, well, I've had a few. It's bridging those gaps sometimes between the very low context and the very high context cultures. That can be the most challenging environment, and sort of bringing people to the same page. And you spend a huge amount of time, Sally, working out how do you deliver a message from one room to the other in a way that is intended and going to be received in the appropriate way. So yeah, that's the if I come away from a mediation exhausted, that's generally the one where I come away most drained.
Yeah, great. And I think related to that is a question here from Anne, well, more of a statement really, about the research that you need to do on cultures prior to a cross-cultural piece of mediation.
So I would start with Erin Meyer's book as a really good starting point, and there's lots of content on the internet about high context and low context cultures and individualist and collectivist cultures. And I did law and economics as a degree at university. Part of that was included psychology, and I've always been very much a people person. And if you're, I think as a mediator, you are naturally a people person. It will come naturally to you to the curiosity of your mind will take over. But Erin Meyer's book is a really good place to start.
Great, that's a super tip.
Okay, pleasure.
Super tip to finish with. Yeah, that looks like it's it on the questions, Peter. So it remains for me to thank you very much, Peter Taylor, managing partner at Paris Smith, one of our major sponsors and supporters for the IMAW week, which we really, really appreciate you coming along and giving your time today and your wisdom and insight. It's absolutely great. So thank you very much for that. Thank you to all of you for coming along and listening this morning, and we look forward to you attending some of the other events. Please have a look at the portal and log on. A tip from me is, how about going to one of the events at another region if you can manage the time difference. So have a look for that. Later in the week, we have our global debate being chaired by Jonathan Lux. This is whether the Western model of mediation is fit for a multicultural society. And that's going to be joined by representatives from all over the world. So please do come to that. And finally, my big plug is for attendees of the IMAW. You may join or renew or extend your membership of the Mediator Network for a fee of £99 during November. So do talk to the Mediator Network team to find out more. I'm certainly going to be putting my £99 worth into my current membership to extend it at that really bargain price. So you'll get a lot of benefit from it. So finally, it remains for me to say thank you to Peter and to everybody who's been listening and watching this morning. Thank you very much, and see you at another event soon. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you.